Operation London Bridge was the funeral plan for Queen Elizabeth II. The plan included the announcement of her death, the period of official mourning, and the details of her state funeral. The plan was created as early as the 1960s and revised many times in the years before her death in 2022. The phrase "London Bridge is down" would be used to communicate the death of the Queen to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and key personnel, setting the plan into motion. Bodies involved in preparing the plan included various government departments, the Church of England, Metropolitan Police Service, the British Armed Forces, the media, the Royal Parks, London Boroughs, the Greater London Authority and Transport for London. Some critical decisions relating to the plan were made by the Queen herself, while some were left to be determined by her successor. Reporting on the preparations, The Guardian described them as planned to the minute with arcane and highly specific details. Several other plans were also created to support the implementation of Operation London Bridge, such as Operation Unicorn. Running concurrently with Operation London Bridge were operations concerning King Charles III's accession to the throne and his coronation. Several Commonwealth realms developed their own plans for how to react to the death of the Queen. Background: funerals and coronations of members of the royal family are typically organized by the Earl Marshal and the officers in the College of Arms. Preparations for Elizabeth II's death and funeral have also been made by the Cabinet Office. Predetermined phrases have typically been used as code names for plans relating to the death and funeral of a royal family member. Initially, code names were used by key officials in an effort to prevent Buckingham Palace switchboard operators from learning of the death prior to a public announcement. When King George VI died in 1952, key government officials were informed with the phrase Hyde Park Corner. Several code-named funeral plans for royal family members in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have used the names of prominent bridges in the United Kingdom. Operation Tay Bridge was the phrase used for the death and funeral plans of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which was rehearsed for 22 years before its eventual use in 2002. The funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales in 1997 was also modelled after Operation Tay Bridge. As of March 2017, the phrase Operation Forth Bridge referred to the death and funeral of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who died in 2021, while Operation Mina Bridge referred to the funeral plan for King Charles III. All coded operations for members of the royal family, including the plan for Elizabeth II, form a part of Operation Lion, an overarching plan for any royal death. Plan. Preparations for Queen Elizabeth II's death and funeral date back to the 1960s, with the plan having undergone multiple changes in the decades since. The plan was updated 3 times a year through a meeting involving government department officials, the police, and broadcasters. The plan that outlines the process between the death of the Queen and her funeral is code-named Operation London Bridge. On the death of the Queen, her private secretary would be the first official to convey the news. Their first act would be to contact the Prime Minister, where civil servants would convey the code phrase "London Bridge is down" to the Prime Minister using secure telephone lines. The Cabinet Secretary and the Privy Council office would also be informed by the private secretary. The Cabinet Secretary would then convey the news to ministers and senior civil servants. The Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's Global Response Centre, based at a secret location in London, would communicate the news to the governments of the 14 other countries of which Elizabeth is Queen, and to the governments of the other countries of the Commonwealth of Nations. Government websites and social media accounts, as well as the royal family's website, would turn black, and publication of non-urgent content would be avoided. The media would be informed by announcement to PA Media and the BBC through the radio alert transmission system and to commercial radio on the independent radio news through a network of blue obit lights which would alert presenters to play inoffensive music and prepare for a news flash, while BBC Two would suspend scheduled programming and switch to BBC One's broadcast of the announcement. BBC News would air a pre-recorded sequence of portraits, during which the presenters on duty at the time would prepare for the formal announcement by putting on dark clothing prepared for this purpose. The Guardian has reported that The Times has 11 days of prepared coverage ready and that ITN and Sky News have long rehearsed her death, substituting the name MRS Robinson for the Queen's. A footman would pin a dark-edged notice to the gates of Buckingham Palace. At the same time, the palace website would display the same notice. The Parliament of the United Kingdom and the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish parliaments would meet as soon as is practical or be recalled if they are not sitting. The Prime Minister would address the House of Commons. The new monarch would host a meeting with the Prime Minister and then deliver a speech to the nation at 6 p.m., the evening following the Queen's death. Whitehall and local government buildings would fly flags at half-mast and books of condolence may be opened. Ceremonial ornaments, such as ceremonial maces or council chains, are to be put in black purses. Gun salutes would take place at saluting stations and a service of remembrance, to be attended by the Prime Minister and senior ministers, would be held at St. Paul's Cathedral. 10 days after the Queen's death, a state funeral led by the Archbishop of Canterbury would be held at Westminster Abbey. A funeral procession was also planned, with the Queen deciding on the order of the procession. A 2-minute silence would take place across the United Kingdom at midday and processions would gather in London and Windsor. Her body would then be buried in a prepared tomb at King George VI Memorial Chapel in St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, alongside Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose coffin would be moved from the royal vault. A committal service would be held at St. George's Chapel before the burial. As agreed by the Queen and the Prime Minister, the day of the funeral would be declared a day of national mourning, although a bank holiday would not be granted. Supporting operations. Operation London Bridge included several ancillary and supporting plans, such as the plans for the arrangements at Westminster Hall. This includes Operation Marquee, a plan that covers the ceremonial, service and vigil aspects of the Queen's lying in state inside Westminster Hall, and Operation Feather, which concerns the logistical details with the public outside building. Several plans were also created that outlined the arrangements for moving the Queen's coffin, depending on where she died. In the event she had died at Windsor Castle or Sandringham House, the coffin would have been taken by royal train to St. Pancras railway station in London, where the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers would be waiting. Had the Queen died outside the UK, Operation Overstudy provided that her coffin would have been flown to RAF Nordholt by No. 32 Squadron. In every scenario, the coffin, upon its arrival in London, would be transported by hearse to Buckingham Palace where it would rest in the throne room. 5 days after the Queen's death, the coffin would have been moved to Westminster Hall and, after a service, the Queen would lie in state for 3 days. Operation Unicorn. Related operations. The plans for the event of the Queen's death and funeral would occur concurrently with other related plans, including the plans for the accession of King Charles III to the throne, Operation Springtide, and his coronation plans, Operation Golden Orb. Operation Springtide. Implementation. Operation London Bridge and Operation Unicorn were activated upon the death of Elizabeth II, which occurred on September 8, 2022 at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Although the operation was intended to be brought into action on the day that Elizabeth II passed away, the late time of her death rendered it inconvenient to convene the Accession Council at short notice. The decision was taken to designate the following day, September 9, as D-Day. This also avoided the problem of the funeral taking place on a Sunday. In a change from the reported plan, Charles III announced upon his proclamation that the day of the Queen's funeral would be a bank holiday. Although the Queen did not die overseas, an aeroplane, an RAF C-17 Globemaster, was used to transport the coffin to London. This decision was taken on security grounds, as it would be too difficult to police the entire route. Corresponding plans. Officials from Buckingham Palace and Clarence House, known as the Inter-Realm Working Group, would brief representatives of the Commonwealth realms about the funeral and succession plans surrounding Operation London Bridge. The governments of the Commonwealth realms were informed of the monarch's death from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's Global Response Centre. These realms had devised their own plans for what happened in their respective countries in the days after Elizabeth II's death, which ran concurrently with Operation London Bridge. Australia. Preparations were made in Australia for the death of the Queen, with statements having been already drafted for the Prime Minister and Governor-General of Australia. The Prime Minister would be informed of the Queen's death approximately an hour prior to its formal announcement. The Prime Minister was to wear a black tie immediately after its announcement, with the staff of recent past Prime Ministers having carried a black tie in preparation for the news. The Prime Minister and Governor-General would then return to Canberra to make their statements before departing for London with the Royal Australian Air Force. If not scheduled to sit, the Parliament would be recalled to meet to pass a condolence motion. Plans had the Governor-General issuing the Australian proclamation for the accession of King Charles III and his Australian titles at an appropriate ceremony. A flag notice was issued instructing flags to fly at half-mast immediately for the next 10 days, except on the day the accession of Charles III is proclaimed. Part of Australia's response would include a national day of commemoration, which may be declared a public holiday. A state funeral and special Anglican service would be held. The Australian Defence Force organised several gun salutes coinciding with events in London and participated in ceremonies in the United Kingdom. The Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom observed the Accession Council. In addition, Australian members of the Privy Council of the United Kingdom are entitled to sit on the Accession Council. As reported by The Australian in 2022, 4 official Australian state guests were expected to attend the funeral in London, with an additional 12 Australians also being invited. Canada. In Canada, preparations were made as early as 2002, during Queen Elizabeth II's Golden Jubilee. Consultations over the plans have been made with the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Privy Council Office, the Canadian Secretary to the Queen, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Office of the Governor-General of Canada, and the Office of the Earl Marshal in the United Kingdom. The federal government's planning for the death of the Queen was somewhat reliant on what was outlined in the Manual of Official Procedure of the Government of Canada, a document produced by the Privy Council Office in 1968. In addition to the federal government, provincial governments have also implemented their own contingency plans for the death of the Queen, and the accession of Charles III. After receiving the news about the Queen's death, the Governor-General would recall the Cabinet to Parliament Hill and proclaim that Canada has a new lawful and rightful liege. The Privy Council for Canada had convened to proclaim Charles III in Canada. The Manual of Official Procedure of the Government of Canada states the Prime Minister is responsible for convening the Parliament, tabling a resolution of loyalty and condolence from the Parliament to the next monarch of Canada, and arranging for the motion to be seconded by the Leader of the official opposition. The Prime Minister would then move to adjourn Parliament. The Canadian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom would be expected to represent Canada at the Accession Council. An official mourning period for Elizabeth II would take place, the length of said period to be determined by the federal government, and issued by the Governor-General and the Department of Canadian Heritage. During the mourning period, a national memorial parade and service would be held in Ottawa. Additionally, ceremonial maces, portraits of the Queen, and flagpoles at government houses across Canada were draped in black fabric. A book of condolences was to be laid out near the front entrance of the government houses, with previously planned events cancelled. The death of the sovereign is considered a mandatory half-masting event for the Canadian government. Flags on all federal buildings and establishments in Canada and abroad would be flown at half-mast from the notification of death until sunset on the day of the funeral or memorial service. Specific attire would be worn during the official mourning period. All staff of the Governor-General, provincial lieutenant governors, and territorial commissioners would be immediately issued black ties and black armbands. Other government officials would also wear a black armband. However, some legislative employees have to wear additional attire during the official mourning period. This includes the sergeants-at-arms, who are required to wear black gloves, peak bow ties, and carry a black scabbard and sword, and pages, who are required to wear black cravats, armbands, and ribbons. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation maintained a regularly updated plan for the death of the sovereign, which was considered a broadcast of national importance. Regular programming would be cancelled, advertisements were to be halted, and all CBC television and radio stations would shift to a 24-hour news format. The CBC also had a specially picked squad of broadcasters on call to come to the news desk at the time of the sovereign's death. Plans for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to participate in the funeral procession in London were in place for decades. Originally, the Crown Equerry had planned for the RCMP to use horses from the Household Cavalry. However, the plans were altered to have the RCMP use 4 horses they gifted to the Queen, after the RCMP had submitted a formal request to do so in 2021.